The moment my wife told me she would decide when I was allowed to talk to her, I realized I had spent years fighting for a place in my own marriage. Looking back now, I should have seen it sooner. The warning signs had been there for months, maybe even years, hiding in plain sight like cracks beneath fresh paint. But when you love someone, you learn how to explain away things that should never need explaining. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and until recently, I believed that loyalty could fix almost anything. I believed that if you showed up every day, worked hard, stayed patient, and kept choosing your family, eventually things would work themselves out. That belief carried me through 18 years of marriage. It also kept me blind longer than I care to admit. The night everything changed started like any other Tuesday. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the smell of tomato soup drifted through the house. The clock above the stove read 7:14 p.m. I remember that detail because for some reason, certain moments freeze themselves into your memory forever. Madison sat at the far end of the kitchen island scrolling through her phone. The blue light reflected in her eyes while I stood by the sink rinsing dishes. We hadn't really spoken all evening. That had become normal. A few years ago, silence between us felt comfortable. Recently, it felt crowded, heavy, like there were words neither of us wanted to say out loud. I dried my hands and walked over to the island. "Hey," I said. "I was thinking maybe we could go out this weekend. Just the two of us. Dinner somewhere nice." She didn't look up immediately. Her thumb kept moving across the screen. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. It shouldn't matter how long someone takes to answer their spouse, but when you've spent enough time waiting, you start counting. Finally, she sighed and placed the phone face down. Her expression wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It was something colder, something tired, like she was dealing with a problem she wished would go away. "Ethan," she said, "we need to stop doing this." I remember blinking. Doing what? She leaned back in her chair. This constant need for attention. The words landed harder than they should have. I laughed a little, mostly because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "I'm not asking for attention," I said. "I'm asking to spend time with my wife." She shook her head. "See? That's exactly what I mean." The rain outside grew louder. Somewhere down the hall, the dryer hummed softly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Funny how life can look completely normal while something important breaks right in front of you. Madison folded her arms and stared at me with a calm confidence that made my stomach tighten. Then she said the sentence that would replay in my head for months afterward. "From now on, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. Stop chasing me." For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. I waited for a smile, a laugh, some sign that this conversation was about to return to reality. Nothing came. She meant every word. The room suddenly felt smaller. The kitchen lights seemed brighter. I could hear the refrigerator running behind us. My chest felt tight, but I kept my face neutral. Years of marriage teach you how to hide your reactions. "What does that even mean?" I asked quietly. She shrugged. "It means if I want space, I get space. If I want time alone, I get time alone. And honestly, you need to stop following me around looking for connection every 5 minutes." Following her around. The phrase echoed in my head. I thought about the dinner invitations she'd declined, the walks she no longer joined, the weekends she spent with friends while I stayed home. I thought about all the small efforts I'd made to keep us close. Suddenly, she was describing those efforts as a burden. Looking back, that was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not resentment, something quieter, more dangerous. Clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her of anniversaries I'd planned alone or vacations I'd organized by myself. I didn't list the ways I'd spent years trying to hold us together. Instead, I simply looked at her and nodded once. "Okay," I said. "That's all." One word. Madison seemed surprised. Maybe she expected a debate. Maybe she expected me to defend myself. Instead, I turned off the kitchen light over the sink and walked upstairs. Behind me, I heard her pick up her phone again. The screen glowed blue against the darkness. At the time, she probably thought she'd won something. Maybe she believed she had finally established the boundaries she wanted. What neither of us understood that night was that something had ended in that kitchen. Not the marriage. Not yet. But the chase. The pursuit. The constant reaching for someone who no longer wanted to be reached. As I lay awake staring at the ceiling later that night, listening to the rain slide down the gutters outside, one thought kept returning to me. If she wanted distance, maybe it was time to give her exactly what she asked for. Neither of us knew it then, but that simple decision was about to change everything. The next morning felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor in long golden rectangles, and the coffee maker clicked and hissed exactly the way it had every weekday for the past 10 years. Madison came downstairs wearing a navy blazer, carrying her laptop bag and a travel mug. She moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation from the night before was finished. Maybe it was for her. For me, it had only just begun. I stood by the counter, stirring cream into my coffee while she checked something on her phone. Neither of us spoke. A year earlier, that silence would have bothered me. I would have asked about her schedule. I would have wished her luck at work. I would have tried to create a moment of connection before we both disappeared into another busy day. Instead, I simply took a sip of coffee and watched the morning light move across the hardwood floor. Madison glanced up once, almost as if she expected me to say something. When I did not, her attention drifted back to the screen in her hand. Looking back now, that was probably the first time she noticed the difference. The truth is, people rarely appreciate what is always available. For 18 years, I had been available. Available for conversations. Available for plans. Available for apologies. Available for compromises. Somewhere along the way, my presence had become as predictable as the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Useful, reliable, invisible. As I drove to work that morning, memories followed me down Interstate 71 like shadows. 18 years is a long time to share a life with someone. Long enough to build routines so deeply into your bones that you stop noticing them. Long enough to forget where your story ends and theirs begins. I met Madison when I was 24. She was 21, studying marketing at Ohio State while working weekends at a bookstore near campus. I still remember the smell of coffee and paperbacks the first time I walked in. She was helping a customer find a travel guide, her blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail, laughing at something the customer said. There was nothing dramatic about it. No movie moment. No lightning strike. Just a feeling that made me walk back into that bookstore 3 times in 1 week. Back then, everything seemed easy. We spent entire afternoons wandering farmers markets and small-town festivals. We shared milkshakes at roadside diners and drove with the windows down during summer evenings when the air smelled like cut grass and fresh rain. She used to reach for my hand without thinking. She used to call just because she wanted to hear my voice. Sometimes I wonder when exactly those things disappeared. Maybe relationships do not break all at once. Maybe they fade the way photographs fade, little by little, until one day you realize the colors are gone. At work, I sat through meetings and answered emails, but my thoughts kept drifting backward. There had been signs. Plenty of them. I just never wanted to count them. The canceled date nights. The weekends she suddenly needed for herself. The way conversations became shorter every year. The way her eyes always seemed to be somewhere else even when she was sitting right across from me. For a long time, I told myself it was stress. Careers. Responsibilities. Life. That is what people tell themselves when they are trying to protect something. They mistake patience for progress. Around lunchtime, I walked outside and sat alone on a bench overlooking the company parking lot. The October air felt cool against my face. Cars moved steadily along the road beyond the office complex. A delivery truck backed into a loading dock. Somewhere nearby, a lawn crew trimmed hedges. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. Everyone carrying invisible stories. I pulled out my phone and looked at old photos. There we were at Niagara Falls. Madison smiling beneath a blue rain poncho. There we were holding keys to our first house. There we were standing in front of a Christmas tree with matching sweaters and terrible hairstyles. Looking at those pictures felt like looking at strangers. Not because they were different people, because they still believed things I no longer believed. They believed effort was always enough. They believed love naturally lasted if you protected it. They believed 2 people would always keep choosing each other. What I did not know then was that those memories were not making me sad anymore. They were making me honest. By the time I drove home that evening, the sun was setting behind rows of maple trees, painting the sky orange and gold. Usually, I would text Madison on my way back. Ask if she needed anything from the grocery store. Ask what she wanted for dinner. Ask about her day. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. Then I locked the phone and placed it back in the center console. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar. but it also felt peaceful. For the first time in years, I was not chasing a response. I was not waiting for validation. I was not trying to earn attention from someone who should have been freely giving it. As the miles rolled beneath my tires and the evening sky darkened above Ohio, one realization settled quietly into my mind. The man who had spent 18 years running toward his marriage had finally stopped running. And I had a feeling Madison had not yet noticed what that would cost her. For the next few weeks, I kept my promise to myself. I did not make announcements. I did not start arguments. I did not deliver dramatic speeches across the dinner table. I simply stopped participating in a game I had been losing for years. The strange thing about stepping back is that at first nobody notices, especially the person who has grown accustomed to you always stepping forward. Madison continued living exactly as she always had. She left early for work, came home late, spent evenings scrolling through her phone, and disappeared most Saturdays with friends from her office. The routines remained the same, but my role inside those routines began to change. Before, I would ask questions. How was your day? What are your plans this weekend? Do you want to grab dinner Friday night? Those questions slowly vanished. Not because I was trying to punish her. I was simply tired of offering invitations that felt like obligations. Looking back, I think that was the first thing she truly noticed. One Thursday evening, I was sitting on the back patio watching the sunset bleed across the October sky. The air smelled like fallen leaves and distant with smoke. I had a glass of iced tea beside me and a football game playing quietly on my phone. Madison stepped through the sliding door carrying her laptop. She stopped for a moment as if surprised to find me outside. Usually, by that hour, I would have checked on her twice. Asked if she needed anything. Asked whether she wanted company. Instead, I sat there enjoying the cool air. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. I glanced toward the orange horizon. "Relaxing." She nodded slowly. Then she went back inside. A small interaction. Meaningless on the surface. But something about the look on her face stayed with me. It was not disappointment. It was confusion. As though a familiar piece of furniture had suddenly been moved to a different room. A few days later, another moment arrived. We were attending a birthday dinner for one of her coworkers at a restaurant downtown. The place was crowded, filled with polished wood tables, hanging Edison bulbs, and the sound of conversations blending into one constant hum. For years, events like this followed the same pattern. Madison would circulate through the room while I lingered nearby. Occasionally, she would introduce me to someone new. Occasionally, she would disappear into conversations that lasted 30 minutes or more while I waited. Patiently. That night was different. After finishing my meal, I struck up a conversation with another guest named Mark. He was a project manager who shared my interest in classic cars. We spent nearly an hour talking about old Mustangs, engine rebuilds, and road trips through the Midwest. For the first time in a long while, I was genuinely enjoying myself. At some point, Madison walked over. "I have been looking for you," she said. The sentence caught me off guard. Normally, I was the one looking for her. Mark excused himself, and Madison sat down across from me. "You disappeared," she added. I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I took a sip of water. "I was right here." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, next time let me know." Looking back now, I realized that was not really about communication. It was about expectations. The rules had quietly changed, and neither of us had discussed them. For years, I had occupied the role of pursuer. Suddenly, without warning, I was no longer playing that part. What I did not know then was how uncomfortable that would become for her. The following weekend brought another shift. Every Saturday morning for nearly a decade, I had built my schedule around Madison. If she wanted brunch, we went to brunch. If she wanted to shop, I tagged along. If she wanted the day to herself, I stayed available just in case. That Saturday, I woke up early and drove 40 miles to a classic car show outside Columbus. The morning sun reflected off rows of polished chrome and freshly restored paint. Hundreds of enthusiasts wandered between vintage trucks and muscle cars, while local vendors sold coffee and breakfast sandwiches. It was exactly the kind of event I used to enjoy before I convinced myself every free hour needed to revolve around my marriage. Around noon, my phone buzzed. "Madison." I stared at the screen for a second before answering. "Hey," I said. "Where are you?" she asked. There was a pause. Not an angry pause. A surprised one. "I am at a car show." "You are?" Another pause. "Since when?" I smiled to myself. "Since before we got married," I almost said. Instead, I looked across the parking lot at a restored 1967 Mustang gleaming beneath the sunlight. Since today, she hesitated. Oh, okay. The call ended a few moments later. As I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I felt something I had not felt in years. Freedom. Not freedom from responsibility. Not freedom from commitment. Freedom from constantly monitoring another person's approval. As the afternoon sun warmed the pavement and conversations drifted through the crowd around me, one thought kept returning. For years, Madison had been the center of my emotional world. Now that center was shifting. Slowly, quietly, and somewhere beneath her confidence. I had a feeling she was beginning to sense the ground moving beneath her feet. The realization arrived on a quiet Wednesday evening while I was sitting alone in a small diner 20 minutes from home. The place was nothing special. Red vinyl booths, black and white photographs on the walls, the smell of coffee that had probably been brewing since sunrise. I had stopped there after work because I felt like eating somewhere different. No planning, no discussion, no checking whether it fit someone else's schedule. Just a simple decision. As I waited for my meal, I caught myself smiling at something I had not expected. I was comfortable, not excited, not distracted, comfortable. That feeling stayed with me during the drive home. It stayed with me when I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Madison was sitting on the couch with her laptop balanced on her knees. The television played quietly in the background. Normally, she barely looked up when I came home. That night was different. "Where were you?" she asked. I set my keys on the table. "Dinner." She blinked. "Dinner where?" The question surprised me. Not because it was unreasonable, because it was unusual. For years, she had shown little interest in where I spent my time. Now there was curiosity in her voice. Maybe even concern. "Just a diner outside town," I said. "Food was pretty good." She stared at me for a moment. "You went alone?" I nodded. "Yeah." The conversation ended there, but something lingered in the room after it ended. An awkwardness neither of us acknowledged. Later that night, lying awake in bed, I thought about the exchange. Not because it was important, because it felt unfamiliar. The following week brought another moment. A small one. The kind people usually ignore. Madison came home early on Friday. I was in the garage organizing tools and listening to a podcast about classic car restoration. The late afternoon sun streamed through the open garage door, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. I heard her car pull into the driveway. A minute later, she appeared in the doorway. "A few people from work are meeting downtown tonight," she said. I was thinking maybe we could go. The words caught me off guard. For years, I had been the one extending invitations. For years, I had been the one trying to create opportunities for us to spend time together. Now the invitation was coming from her. I set down the wrench in my hand. "I appreciate that," I said. "But I already made plans." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Plans?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded like she genuinely did not expect me to have any. "Mark invited me to a car auction tonight," I said. I told him I would go. For a second, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The same way clouds shift before a storm you cannot quite see yet. "Oh," she said. "Okay." Then she turned and walked back inside. Looking back now, I think that was the first time she experienced disappointment because of me. For years, my schedule had been flexible whenever she needed it. My availability had been guaranteed. Suddenly, it was not. What I did not understand then was that people often value something more once they realize it is no longer guaranteed. Over the next several days, subtle changes continued. Madison started texting me during the day. Nothing major. Simple messages. Questions about work. Comments about the weather. Random observations. The kind of conversations that used to come naturally between us years earlier. Part of me wanted to feel hopeful. Another part remained cautious. I had spent too long chasing signs that things were improving. One rainy Sunday afternoon, the moment that changed everything finally arrived. We were sitting in the living room. The house was quiet except for the steady sound of rain against the windows. Madison looked up from her phone and studied me for several seconds. "You seem different lately," she said. I kept my eyes on the book in my hands. "Different how?" She hesitated. "I do not know. Distant maybe." The irony almost made me smile. For years I had felt that distance growing between us. For years I had tried to close it. Now she was finally noticing it herself. I closed the book and looked out the window. Water slid down the glass in long silver lines. The yard beyond looked blurred and uncertain beneath the gray sky. Maybe I am just spending more time focusing on myself, I said. Madison did not respond immediately. The silence stretched between us. Heavy, uncomfortable, honest. Then she quietly asked a question that told me more than anything else ever could. Are you upset with me? I looked at her and saw something I had not seen in a very long time. Uncertainty. Not anger. Not frustration. Uncertainty. And in that moment I realized something important. The game had changed. The person who once felt completely secure in my pursuit was no longer sure where she stood. The balance had shifted, and neither of us could pretend otherwise anymore. After she asked that question, the house felt different. Nothing visible had changed. The same framed photographs lined the hallway. The same clock ticked above the fireplace. The same rain continued sliding down the windows. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface. Madison was beginning to notice the absence of something she had spent years taking for granted. I did not answer her question immediately. Instead, I looked at the rain outside and thought about how many times I had asked myself a similar question over the years. Was I upset? Was I disappointed? Was I lonely? The truth was more complicated than any single word. No, I finally said. I do not think I am upset. She studied my face carefully. Then what is it? I considered the question. I think I am just tired. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she did not fully understand. Neither did I. Not yet. The following days passed quietly. Madison seemed more attentive than before. Small things started happening. She would ask about my day at dinner. She would linger in conversations instead of ending them after a few minutes. Twice, she even suggested watching a movie together. A year earlier, those moments would have filled me with hope. Now they filled me with caution. Looking back, that was one of the hardest lessons I learned. When someone changes after years of emotional distance, you want to believe the change is permanent. But experience teaches patience. Experience teaches observation. One Thursday evening, I arrived home to find Madison cooking dinner. That alone was unusual. We had both fallen into the habit of simple meals and separate schedules. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the kitchen. Soft music played from a speaker near the sink. For a brief moment, the scene reminded me of the early years of our marriage. The years when being together felt natural instead of negotiated. Something smells good, I said as I hung my jacket near the door. She smiled. I thought we could have dinner together tonight. There was a hopeful quality in her voice that caught me by surprise. I sat down at the kitchen island and watched her finish preparing the meal. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow across the room. Steam drifted from a pot on the stove. Outside, the last colors of sunset faded beyond the trees. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. During dinner, Madison talked more than she had in months. She told me stories about work. She asked about a project I was managing. She even laughed at one of my jokes. For a few minutes, everything almost felt normal. Almost. Then something happened that revealed more than she intended. I miss this, she said. I looked up from my plate. Miss what? Us talking like this. The words lingered between us. I set down my fork. We could have done this any time. Her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. She looked away first. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly. Sometimes it sits down at the table and refuses to leave. That night, after dinner, I sat on the back porch while the temperature dropped into the low 50s. A light breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee and thought about the conversation. What struck me was not what Madison had said. It was what she had not said. She never acknowledged how long the distance had existed. She never acknowledged the years I spent trying to close it. She simply missed the comfort that used to be available whenever she wanted it. The next morning brought another clue. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing reports at work. A message from Madison appeared on the screen. Hope your day is going well. A second message followed a few moments later. Maybe we could grab lunch together next week? I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Months earlier, a message like that would have brightened my entire day. Now I simply smiled and placed the phone back on my desk. Not because I was cold. Not because I wanted revenge. Because my emotional world was no longer revolving around every sign of attention she offered. For the first time in years, my happiness did not depend on whether she reached for me. As the afternoon sun filtered through the office windows, I found myself thinking about something strange. Madison was trying harder now than she had in a long time. Yet the more effort she made, the more I realized how much of myself I had already reclaimed. The man who once measured his worth by her attention was disappearing. In his place stood someone quieter, someone steadier, someone who no longer felt responsible for carrying the entire emotional weight of a marriage alone. And deep down, I had a growing suspicion that Madison could feel that change too. The problem was that by the time she finally noticed it, I was no longer moving toward her. I was learning how to move forward on my own. The weeks that followed felt strangely calm. Not because everything was fixed. Quite the opposite. The calm came from finally stepping off a treadmill I had been running on for years. Every morning I woke up, went to work, handled my responsibilities, and spent my free time doing things I genuinely enjoyed. I joined a Saturday morning cars and coffee group. Outside Columbus, I started taking longer walks after dinner. I even signed up for a weekend photography class after realizing how much I missed carrying a camera. None of these changes were dramatic. They were small decisions. But together they created something I had not felt in a very long time. Momentum. One evening I returned home carrying a framed photograph I had taken during class. It showed an old red barn sitting beneath a golden Ohio sunset. The colors were rich and warm. The kind of image that makes ordinary life feel beautiful. Madison was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. She looked up and immediately noticed the frame. "What is that?" she asked. I set it carefully on the counter. "One of my photos." She stood and walked over. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. "You took this?" There was genuine surprise in her voice. "Last weekend." She looked back at me. "I did not even know you were taking a photography class." The statement lingered in the air. Not accusatory, just honest. I nodded. "I signed up a few weeks ago." Madison slowly returned her attention to the picture. "It is really good." Looking back now, that moment revealed more than either of us realized. She was discovering parts of me that had always existed, but had been buried beneath years of trying to keep our relationship afloat. For so long, my identity had revolved around being available, dependable, and accommodating. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being interesting even to myself. Now those forgotten pieces were returning. A few days later, another change appeared. Madison started calling during lunch breaks. Sometimes the conversations lasted only a few minutes, sometimes longer. She would ask what I was doing after work. She would ask about my photography class. She would ask about the next car event. One afternoon, she surprised me with a question that caught me completely off guard. "Do you think I could come with you sometime?" I was sitting in my truck outside the office parking lot when she asked it. The autumn sunlight reflected off the windshield. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Come with me where?" "To one of the car events." I smiled. "You have never wanted to go before." There was a brief silence. Maybe I should have. The answer stayed with me long after the call ended. Maybe she should have. Maybe I should have insisted less and lived more. Maybe both things could be true. Around that same time, people around us began noticing changes too. One Friday evening, we attended a neighborhood gathering hosted by friends. It was the kind of event we had attended dozens of times over the years. Backyard fire pit, folding chairs, homemade desserts, conversations about work, sports, and upcoming holidays. Yet this gathering felt different. At one point, I was standing near the fire discussing travel plans with a few neighbors when I noticed Madison watching from across the yard. Not in a suspicious way, not in an angry way, simply watching. Later that night, while driving home beneath a sky full of stars, she finally spoke. "Everyone kept saying how happy you seem lately." I kept my eyes on the road ahead. "Maybe I am." She looked out the passenger window. "I have not seen you like this in years." Neither had I. The realization settled heavily between us. Happiness is a strange thing. People assume it arrives when circumstances improve. Sometimes it arrives when you stop waiting for circumstances to improve and start improving yourself instead. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and stepped onto the back porch with a cup of coffee. The air felt crisp and cool. A thin layer of fog drifted across neighboring yards. Somewhere in the distance, birds greeted the morning. As I stood there watching the first rays of sunlight touch the tops of the trees, I heard the sliding door open behind me. Madison stepped outside wrapped in a light sweater. She stood beside me without speaking. For a while, we simply watched the sunrise together. Then she quietly said something that surprised me more than anything else she had said in months. "I think I forgot who you were." I stared at the horizon. Golden light spread slowly across the landscape. "Maybe I forgot too," I replied. For the first time, neither of us looked away. And deep down, I had a feeling we were finally standing at the edge of the conversation that should have happened years earlier. That conversation stayed with me for days. Not because it solved anything. It did not. If anything, it revealed how much remained unsaid between us. For years we had lived side by side, sharing a house, sharing responsibilities, sharing routines, while quietly drifting farther apart. Now, for the first time, Madison seemed willing to acknowledge the distance. The problem was that I was no longer standing where she expected me to be. A week later, the first real test arrived. It happened on a Thursday evening. I came home from work and found Madison sitting at the kitchen island waiting for me. There was no laptop open, no phone in her hand, just 2 cups of coffee and an expression I could not immediately read. "Can we talk?" she asked. The question would have sounded ordinary to anyone else. To me, it felt strangely familiar. For years I had been the one asking for conversations, the one trying to create space for connection. Now the roles had quietly reversed. I sat across from her and wrapped my hands around the warm coffee mug. Outside, the last light of day faded beyond the windows. The kitchen felt still. Madison looked down for a moment before speaking. "I have been thinking about a lot of things lately." I nodded but remained silent. She took a slow breath. "I do not think I realized how much I was pushing you away." The words landed softly, not as a dramatic confession, more like someone finally admitting what had been obvious for a long time. I stared into the dark surface of my coffee. Maybe neither of us realized it when it was happening. She shook her head. "No, I think you knew." There was honesty in her voice now, the kind that only appears after denial has exhausted itself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind us. Somewhere upstairs, the heating system clicked on. Ordinary sounds. Yet the conversation felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Then Madison said something I never expected to hear. "I thought you would always be there no matter how little effort I gave." I looked up. Her eyes were fixed on the table. And that sounds terrible when I say it out loud. Looking back now, that was the moment everything became clear. Not because she had suddenly changed. Not because our marriage was magically repaired. But because the illusion had finally disappeared. For years, Madison had operated from certainty. Certainty that I would keep pursuing. Certainty that I would keep compensating for whatever was missing. Certainty that my loyalty had no expiration date. Now that certainty was gone, the following weekend provided even more evidence. Madison suggested we spend Saturday together. Not because there was an event. Not because there was an obligation. Simply because she wanted to. Months earlier, I would have rearranged my entire schedule without hesitation. This time I checked my calendar first. Photography class in the morning. Lunch with Mark afterward. A commitment I had already made. "I can spend the afternoon together," I said. "But I already have plans earlier." A flicker of disappointment crossed her face before she quickly hid it. The reaction lasted less than a second. Still, I noticed. Because I recognized it. It was the same feeling I had experienced countless times over the years when my efforts were not returned. The difference was that now she was the one experiencing it. Saturday arrived bright and clear. Crisp autumn air filled the town. Trees blazed with shades of red, gold, and orange. After photography class, I met Mark at a small diner near the river. We talked about work, travel, and the upcoming winter season. At one point, he looked across the table and smiled. "You seem different these days." I laughed. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it is true." He stirred his coffee. "You seem lighter." The word stayed with me. Lighter. Maybe that was exactly it. Not happier every moment. Not free from uncertainty. Just lighter. Like I had finally stopped carrying something that was never mine to carry alone. When I returned home later that afternoon, Madison was sitting on the back porch reading a book. The sunlight painted golden streaks across the yard. Fallen leaves drifted lazily across the grass. She looked up as I approached. "How was your day?" she asked. I sat down beside her. "Pretty good." She smiled. "I am glad." The simplicity of the exchange struck me. No tension, no pursuit, no performance. Just two people talking honestly. Yet beneath that calm surface, I could feel something changing. Madison was no longer trying to manage the distance between us. She was trying to understand it. And for the first time in a very long while, I had a feeling she was beginning to understand exactly how far away I had already traveled. The conversation I had been expecting finally arrived on a cold November evening. The trees outside were nearly bare now, their branches dark against a gray sky that threatened rain. I came home later than usual after stopping to photograph an old covered bridge outside town. The house was quiet when I walked in. No television, no music, no sound except the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Madison was sitting at the dining room table waiting for me. The moment I saw her expression, I knew this was not another casual conversation. Something had changed. I hung my jacket by the door and walked over. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Can we talk?" There was a seriousness in her voice that made me pull out a chair and sit across from her. For a few moments, she said nothing. Her fingers rested on the table, folded tightly together. She looked nervous. That alone felt unfamiliar. Madison had always been confident, certain, composed. Tonight, she looked like someone standing on uncertain ground. Finally, she took a breath. "I think I made a mistake." I remained silent. She continued. "Actually, I think I made a lot of mistakes." The room felt still. Outside, wind rattled a few remaining leaves against the windows. I listened carefully because something told me this moment mattered. "I spent years believing you would always be there," she said. "No matter how distant I became, no matter how little effort I gave." Her voice grew quieter. "And when you stopped chasing me, I thought it would only last a few days." I looked down at the grain of the wooden table. Looking back now, I realized how true that was. She had expected resistance. Arguments, pleading, negotiation. She had expected the version of me that always returned to restore balance whenever things felt unstable. Instead, I had simply stepped away. Madison swallowed hard. Then weeks passed. She shook her head slightly. "And suddenly you had a life that did not revolve around me." There it was. The truth neither of us had fully spoken aloud until now. I sat quietly while she continued. "At first I told myself it was a phase. Then I started noticing things. You seemed happier, more confident, more relaxed. People around us noticed it too." She looked directly at me, and that scared me. The honesty surprised me, not because she felt that way, because she was finally willing to admit it. Rain began tapping softly against the windows. A familiar sound, the kind that always seems to accompany important moments in life. Madison looked away for a second before speaking again. "A few months ago, I thought I had all the control." The sentence instantly transported me back to that night in the kitchen, back to the moment everything had changed. She gave a sad smile. "Now I realize I never had control. I just had certainty." I felt something shift inside me. Not satisfaction, not victory, understanding, because she was finally describing the same reality I had spent years living inside. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you still want this marriage?" The words hung between us. Heavy, honest, impossible to ignore. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I listened to the rain. I thought about 18 years together. The bookstore where we met. The weeks after that conversation moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just differently. Something had changed between us, and for once it was not hidden beneath routines or assumptions. The truth was out in the open. Madison no longer pretended everything was fine, and I no longer pretended that carrying a relationship alone was sustainable. Winter arrived gradually across Ohio. The trees stood bare against pale skies. Frost appeared on rooftops in the early mornings. Christmas lights began appearing throughout the neighborhood, adding small pockets of color to the long evenings. One Saturday morning, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and found the world covered in a thin layer of snow. The yard looked quiet and untouched. For a few minutes, I simply stood there breathing in the cold air. A year earlier, I would have been thinking about how to fix my marriage. That morning, I found myself thinking about how grateful I was to have found myself again. Behind me, the sliding door opened. Madison stepped onto the porch wrapped in a thick sweater. She stood beside me and looked out at the snow-covered neighborhood. Neither of us spoke immediately. We did not need to. The silence felt comfortable now, honest. Eventually, she looked at me and smiled softly. "You seem peaceful." I stared at the sunrise reflecting across the snow. "I think I am." She nodded as if she already knew the answer. Looking back, that was the real turning point of the story. Not the argument, not the distance, not even the conversation at the dining room table. The turning point was the moment I stopped trying to force someone else to choose me and started choosing myself. Everything else happened afterward. During the following months, Madison continued making an effort. Not grand gestures, not dramatic promises. Consistent effort. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She showed interest in the parts of my life she had ignored before. She attended one of my photography exhibits at a local community center. She came to a Cars and Coffee event and spent 2 hours walking through rows of vintage vehicles, even though she knew almost nothing about them. The important thing was not what she did. It was why she did it. For the first time in years, she was participating instead of expecting. One evening in early spring, we took a walk through a park near the river. The snow was gone. Trees were beginning to bloom again. Families pushed strollers along the walking paths while cyclists passed in the distance. The air smelled like fresh grass and wet earth. We walked side by side without rushing. At one point, Madison stopped and looked toward the water. I spent a long time believing love meant someone would always stay no matter how little I gave back. Her voice was quiet. I was wrong. I looked across the river, where sunlight danced on the surface. Most people learn important lessons the hard way. She smiled sadly, including me. The strange thing was that I no longer felt anger when she admitted those things. Anger requires you to keep living in the past. I was not living there anymore. Neither of us was. By summer, our marriage looked different than it ever had before. Not perfect. Real. There is a difference. We talked more honestly. We respected each other's independence. We spent time together because we wanted to, not because one of us was desperately trying to maintain a connection. The balance had changed. The dynamic had changed. Most importantly, I had changed. One evening nearly a year after everything began, Madison and I sat on the back patio, watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. Fireflies drifted across the yard. The air felt warm and still. She reached for my hand and held it quietly. No speeches, no promises, just a simple gesture. As I sat there, I thought about the man I had been before all of this happened. The man who believed love meant endless pursuit. The man who confused loyalty with self-sacrifice. The man who kept running after someone who was walking away. I did not hate that version of myself. He had done the best he could with what he knew. But I was grateful I was no longer him. Because the biggest lesson I learned was not about marriage. It was not about Madison. It was not even about relationships. It was about self-respect. The moment I stopped chasing validation was the moment I became someone worth finding again. And in the end, the person who finally understood that truth was not just me. It was Madison too.